Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to all those assembled. I want to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about respect and what it means, because I think we're living in a time where people are finding it hard to feel respected. If you're working hard at a full-time job and interest rates are going up and the conversation you're having around your table is whether you're going to continue to be able to afford your home, whether that's because of mortgage payments or rent that continues to climb much faster than any possible justification for it, I think you feel like you can't get respect. People that are young people that are working in the economy, they're working at 4 or 5 different jobs in the gig economy trying to make a go, who are giving up on the dream of home ownership and wondering if they're going to be able to afford to buy their food as they try and figure out time to eat between the different jobs and the places that they have to get in order to work them, don't feel like the effort that they're putting in is respected right now. People facing layoffs and know that there isn't a decent employment insurance system to count on because some of the improvements that were there just for the last couple of years during the pandemic were taken away by the government in September, even as it begins to talk about the possibility of recession, or feeling like they're not getting any respect, that their government isn't there to put in place the kinds of things that they need in order to weather the storm. People living with disabilities that can't work at all or who can only work part-time. And I think, there's many people that, due to COVID, have had the experience of either not being able to work for reasons beyond their control or who haven't been able to get enough work. I think a lot of Canadians now know that pain, which is one that people living with disabilities in Canada have known for far too long. They can't get respect. And when they see that the meager disability pensions that various levels of government offer that have been legislating people living with disabilities into poverty for years, even before the pandemic, aren't going up in the context of inflation, it's hard to feel respected. If you're a senior that worked your whole life and you're now trying to make it on a fixed income that doesn't really grow, certainly doesn't grow at the pace of the extraordinary amount of inflation we've seen in essentials, you don't feel like the career that you had to fight for that pension and to earn that pension over time is being respected when it gets burned up so that companies like Loblaws can make another $1 million a day of profit. If you're an Indigenous person in Canada who's part of generations of people who haven't been able to access good economic opportunities and services at home, who find systemic racism and jurisdictional disputes getting in the way when they move to the city to being able to access those opportunities and services, that's not respect. And that's a long and ongoing disrespect that Canada has paid far too often to its Indigenous people. If you're a sick Canadian right now and you just need to go to the hospital, you need to take your kid to the hospital, your parent to the hospital, it's hard to feel respected when you walk in and you see the incredible need that is there and the fact that governments have not risen to the occasion to invest in the training and the employees and the infrastructure that we need in order to be able to deliver good health services. So on top of all the real financial distress that people are experiencing, I think there's also this tremendous feeling of disrespect, of working really hard, of doing the things that people can in order to make it, and that more and more not being enough, and the people that should be there to have their back and try and create structures and systems that allow people that are working hard in their own way to succeed aren't doing that job. And respect requires a few things, Madam Speaker. I don't pretend to have a comprehensive list today, but I want to offer up some of the things that I think are particularly pertinent to debate in this place and some of the policies that we could adopt here in order to make life a little bit easier for Canadians. Certainly one thing that respect requires is civility. We have to treat each other well. Respect requires that we're honest with each other. There's certainly a lack of that in this place far too often. And the third thing that I think it requires that speaks to some of the problems that I opened up the speech with are results. Because you can talk at people all you like, and if at the end of the day things don't actually get better, if there isn't actually material improvement that they can feel in their household budget, then it doesn't matter what we say in this place. At the end of the day, we're not respecting people if we're not coming to the table and working together to implement real solutions that are going to make a difference in their life. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about civility, which is something that we've talked a lot, unfortunately, this year about, because there's just such a pronounced lack of it. So it starts by us at least being able to, even though we disagree, we have some strong disagreements in this place. That's okay, that's what this place is for. But we need to do that in a way that respects that other people can have a different opinion and that doesn't make them demons or monsters or traitors or treasonous or whatever else, whatever other word you want to substitute in. Just because somebody disagrees with us doesn't mean that we should adopt a conspiracy theory that they're part of some kind of world movement to undermine everybody. Just because somebody disagrees with us doesn't mean that it's okay to promote the use of violence or to attack them physically. That's not okay. We've seen too much of that in Canada, and we've seen too much of it encouraged, frankly, in the kind of irresponsible rhetoric that too often finds its way to the floor of the House of Commons. And so that's why, and I am going to disagree with some people today, and I'm going to be harsh in my criticism. That's okay. It's when it gets taken to the next level that it's a real problem, and I think it's a problem that's too present, and it's undermining Canadian democracy. And unfortunately, I think we're living in a time where that's not an alarmist thing to say. It's a truth that needs to be spoken. So it's in that spirit that I'm going to engage in what I hope is some meaningful and constructive criticism here today. I think we have to be honest with each other if we want to show respect to ourselves, to each other in this place, but to Canadians. And so I want to highlight some things, some issues where I think there is a pronounced lack of honesty about what's really going on. And that's important not just from the point of view of respect, but in the sense of just being honest for its own sake. It's important because if we want to get to that other part, the results, we have to be honest about what the problems are. And if we can't be honest about what the problems are and where they come from, or if certain political agendas are allowed to obscure too badly what the real causes of the problems are, then we won't get to the solutions and we won't get the results that we need. So we talk a lot about inflation in this place, and inflation is a real problem. That much is true, and that's honest, and you'll hear that from all sides. But if we want to get to tackling the problem of inflation, then I think some of the narratives around here are quite unhelpful. For as much as I think it's true that the liquidity that was offered to banks right at the beginning of the pandemic, just as it was under the previous Conservative government when the Great Recession of 2008 hit, even though I think it's plausible that some of that liquidity did pour more gasoline on the fire in our housing market, I don't think it's plausible to try and pretend that that moment in 2020 caused the housing crisis in Canada. How do we know that that's true? Well, anyone with a memory that extends back past 2020, which I hope is anyone serving in this place, will know that housing was getting more and more unaffordable then, and that it was breaking household budgets then, and that we've been on a trajectory for the last 20 years that has seen housing prices skyrocket. So just in the case of inflation in the housing market alone, it is simply not true to say that this is a new problem since 2020 and it's all been fueled by government dollars. In fact, the people buying up these properties are private actors in the housing market. And they were sitting on tons of cash before the pandemic, thank you very much, and also finding ways to buy properties in the housing market and make housing more and more unaffordable for people that don't have a lot of means so that they could rent those same places out to renters. And one of the places where this started was when the Harper government refused to renew the operating grants of affordable housing that was built in the 60s and the 70s. And that wasn't even the starting place. It was just another place you can go back to 2015 and a little bit earlier to see where real estate investment trusts started slobbering all over formerly affordable buildings that they could pay for with the money they already had in hand, mostly due to corporate tax cuts that were initiated in 2000 by the Chrétien Liberals and continued by the Harper Conservatives, that Jim Flaherty himself complained businesses weren't spending, reinvesting in real capital that enhanced Canadian productivity. Those piles of cash were being used to get into real estate. So let's not pretend somehow that public spending alone manufactured a housing crisis in Canada. It's not true, and we won't fix the problem until everybody in this place, including the leader of the Conservatives, acknowledges that. So let's have a little honesty about the root causes of that stuff. Let's also have some honesty and recognize that we're in a time of serious global supply chain shortage, and that is driving a lot of inflation when it comes to the price of many things. People who've been fortunate enough in this time to purchase automobiles who have complained about the long wait. Well, that's because they can't get the chips from China, because China has a zero-tolerance COVID policy. So they often don't have workers in the factories that make the chips, partly because of the free trade agenda of Liberals and Conservatives alike that outsourced that work at the end of the 80s and the early 90s instead of building that stuff here. So it's a little rich to hear Conservatives these days talk about reshoring and free trade out the both sides of their mouth at the same time. Thank you very much. Let's talk a little bit about the role that corporate greed is playing in inflation. We've seen reports that say as much as 25% of the current inflation that we're experiencing comes from price increases that go above and beyond the cost increases that companies are experiencing. So that's a real thing. And when we look at the report about Loblaws today, and we see that mad money is being made by a number of companies, we see that profit happening in the oil and gas sector. We saw it with big box stores in the pandemic. We know that these price increases are being charged on the very market principles that Conservatives and Liberals alike love to defend, which is charge what the market can bear. It's why the government doesn't want to implement a windfall profit tax, because they think if you're in the right place at the right time and you own something that you can charge a lot for, that's good. That's what you should be doing. Doesn't matter if that's food, doesn't matter if that's socks, doesn't matter if that's rent, doesn't matter if it's a Nintendo, to them it's all the same. And what New Democrats have been trying to say in this place for a long time is that not all goods in the market are the same. There are goods that people can't do without. They are not goods. They're not wants. They're not desires. They are needs. Yes. Yep. And we should have a government that structures our economy to make sure that people can access the things they need and leave to the market the things they simply want.
Yep. That's right.
And that's a meaningful difference. I think we need a little honesty in this place when it comes to what it means to defend the rights of workers. Because we have a leader of the opposition that gets up all the time and pretends that he's defending workers. I remember that he was part of the government with Bill C-377 and 525 that was a direct attack on workers' ability to organize, and I have noticed his pathetic silence when it comes to the Conservative government right now in Ontario preemptively using the notwithstanding clause in order to deny the collective bargaining rights of workers. And I find it difficult to see the Prime Minister pretend to be a champion for those same rights when I watched in this place as his government introduced and railroaded through, with the help of the Conservatives, back to work legislation for Canada Post workers and workers at the Port of Montreal. So if he's upset just that the Ford government preemptively used the notwithstanding clause, you can be sure he doesn't have an objection to taking away collective bargaining rights by legislating people back to work. Right. Let's have some honesty about that in this place as well. One of the ways that we could help people is by removing the GST on home heating. That's a long-standing NEP position. I thought maybe we'd find some help from the Conservatives, but they're obsessed with the carbon tax. Well, let's have a little honesty about the fact, first of all, the carbon tax doesn't apply everywhere in the country. BC, Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland and Labrador, the Northwest Territories all have their own carbon pricing system. Removing the federal carbon tax from home heating won't do a whit for people who are concerned about the cost of home heating in those provinces. Maybe the provincial or territorial government will do that, but it sure as heck ain't going to happen here. What would help everyone across the country is if we removed the GST on home heating, because that does apply all across the country. It's why it's a better solution. It's why we proposed it in an amendment to a Conservative Opposition Day motion that presumably was about affordability and helping people, and they said no. Why? I'm not going to take that as their permanent answer, because I believe that we have to believe here that people can come to their senses and make better decisions. It's why I asked the leader of the Conservative Party just earlier this day, after his remarks on the fall economic statement, if he would join with us in order to work to get rid of the GST on home heating, and he dodged the question. He never once mentioned the GST in his answer. I found that passing strange. The Liberals are inadequate on this. They should have done something about this in the fall economic statement. It was a clear opportunity to get something done in a time where, yes, they have done some things to help. I'm going to give them that. What have they done to help? Well, they talk about dental care so that children can get access to dental services. For some of them, it'll be the first time in their life. They talk about the Canada Housing Benefit, another $500 a month for low-income renters. They talk about the GST rebate that's going to be rolling out tomorrow, a doubling of the GST rebate for the next 6 months. They talk about investments in childcare. Those are all good things. I remember those things. I remember when we first raised those things and got laughed at by the Liberals, whether it was on the GST rebate, because we didn't need that, the economy is roaring, everything's fine, this inflation is just transitory. I remember running in 2015 on a national childcare strategy. I remember the Liberals running against it. And we kept up the pressure. We kept talking about it. We went out. We talked to Canadians that need childcare in order to be able to go to work. We knew we weren't going to drop the file. We kept pushing until the Liberals came to their senses. I remember just about 18 months ago when the Liberals stood up with the Conservatives in this place in a previous Parliament to vote against dental care. Yep. And it was through the power of our 25 votes in this Parliament that we held them over the barrel and are getting them to actually get it done. So yes, I'm quite aware of some of the things that the Liberal government is doing in order to bring help Canadians. I'm also quite aware of the extent to which those things would not be happening if Canadians in their wisdom hadn't elected a minority parliament and given New Democrats the opportunity to fight for the things that we've always said we would, and that is exactly why we are fighting for those things.
That's right.
One of the things that's in the fall economic statement that, again, has been something, it's in the supply and confidence agreement, is a pandemic dividend. What is that? This time, it's actually a dividend that comes back to Canadians, instead of Canadians paying for the dividends that go to shareholders. It's on banks and insurance companies that made record profits during the pandemic. It's a one-time payment of some of those enormous profits back into the coffers of the Canadian government, not so that it's in the pocket of the government, but so that it goes out in the form of the GST rebate and the dental benefit and the Canada Housing Benefit. That's something that we fought for, including a permanent 1.5% hike on the corporate tax rate for those very same financial institutions. I was glad to see the elimination of student loan interest permanently in this economic statement. That's something I've watched New Democrat MPs get up for the last 7 years that I've been here and talk about, and again, get laughed at by folks on the government benches, and it's because we're here and it's because we're pushing that we see things like that in the fall economic statement. I want to talk a little bit about housing again. There are a few initiatives here. There's a anti-flipping tax, there's a doubling of the first-time homebuyer tax credit, which is something New Democrats have advocated for. But I'll say that these measures are still part of that market-based approach to housing that I believe we really need to move past if we're going to find a solution to the crisis in housing. We have to invest a lot more in non-market housing, and that has to be the priority. If the government isn't going to challenge the culture of housing as a commodity, which it could do by moving on real estate investment trusts, which it could do by buttressing the position of nonprofits that want to build non-market housing. Unfortunately, one of the needs there now is just to cover the difference that interest rates have made for projects that are on the books that now can't go ahead because interest rates have changed the math. If government would come to the table to help them acquire buildings and land quickly when they're having to compete with these REITs, that would be helpful. If they would come to the table to say, we're going to cover the difference in your business plan for your nonprofit housing that you're suffering because of higher interest rates, that would be something that would help. They also need to get serious as part of that, and I want to give a shout out to my colleague from Vancouver East from Question Period earlier today, who was talking about the need for a meaningful and well-funded urban Indigenous housing strategy. The government talks a big game. They want to say that a $300 million investment is a record investment. I think if that's true, what a shameful testament to Canadian history that Indigenous people living in urban centers haven't been able to access more funding for affordable housing far sooner. And it's the kind of thing that we need, but that again is outside the market framework that largely dominates liberal thinking about the housing space. And if we can't break out of that, we're never going to make the difference that we need to make for Canadians in these challenging times. So I've talked a little bit about some of what is in the Fall Economic Statement, but I want to spend some time talking about what's not in it. And as I said earlier, I mean, we're in a very challenging moment as a country. And for all of the things that New Democrats have fought for, some of which the government is doing, some extra things that the government is doing, like the 2% tax on share buybacks, which I think is a positive measure, and I'm glad to see. I don't think it's going to make all the difference. It has to be part of a bigger package. But in addition to those things, there are many other things that really ought to have been here, and that an NDP government would have been keen to put in our own Fall Economic Statement. Consider the question of employment insurance, Madam Speaker. The government just today is starting to talk about a recession in the offing. But just a couple months ago, they took an employment insurance system that had been made better, not perfect, but better during the pandemic. It was easier to qualify for benefits. There was actually a benefit floor. So if you're a part-time worker or somebody working a couple part-time jobs and it's hard to get all the hours, and 55% of your income from those jobs that you've been cobbling together isn't enough to live on, we actually had an income floor so that when you're laid off, you could hope to be able to pay the rent. All of that went by the wayside on September 24th. It's just gone. And we've been saying for years during the pandemic that when those rules expired, when the government was ready to let them expire, that they had to be replaced with meaningful structural reform to the employment insurance system, and that in no way should they let those new rules lapse, because those rules were a lot more on the way to a functional employment insurance system than anything that we had before. So at the very least, they could have kept that in place until they came with their new fix. We still haven't seen what that new fix is. There are rumors about maybe them acting on it this fall. Well, I sure as heck hope so. Because if the rumors about recession in early 2023 are true, people are going to need that employment insurance to be there for them. And only about 4 in 10 working Canadians before the pandemic qualified for employment insurance. That's why it was such a broken system. So we have to find fixes to that. And I had hoped at least that there might have been a reference or a hint as to what the government has in mind for how to fix that system. I was also disappointed to see that the only reference to health care in the Fall Economic Statement was dental care. I'm glad that dental care is there, but man, is there ever a lot more that we need to do. The provinces need more funding for health care, and I believe, as New Democrats do, that the federal government can play a positive role in convening provinces to talk about best practices, to develop a human resources strategy that isn't based on some provinces poaching people that other provinces train, but to have a truly national training strategy where the provinces participate on their own terms, but somebody's got to bring them together in order to have those conversations and to make that happen. And there's a role for the federal government to play there. And we need to acknowledge that a big problem in our healthcare system right now is just not enough trained people available to do the job. That is a national problem right now, and it requires a response with every part of the country working together arm in arm to figure out how we meet that challenge, and it is going to require federal funding to be sure. Not a word about that, and yet that is the reality that so many Canadians are living as they go to hospitals, including the 350 people who are dying from COVID every week still in Canada and are going to the hospital before their death seeking help and finding that they have to wait for hours if they're lucky, days if they're not, in order to get service. How do we pay for many of these things? Well, I talked earlier about a windfall profit tax. We know there are companies that can afford to pay more and ought to be paying more. This is not a time where we should be tolerating exceptional profit well above pre-pandemic levels without asking those same companies to pay a little bit more on that extra profit. It doesn't make sense, because that is some of the money that Canadians are giving up due to higher prices, and we need that money in order to bring the cost of those essential things down. So I would like to think, I hope others will agree, that that was a pretty honest talk about some of the problems that we're facing. I don't expect that everyone's going to agree on some of the solutions that New Democrats are putting on the table, and fair enough. That's what we're here to do. We're here to put ideas out there. We're here to debate them. I hope we're here to find common ground as best we can in the course of debates like this, to be able to move ahead on important measures, like, for instance, removing the GST from home heating as we prepare to go into another cold Canadian winter. So I offer, as I say, what I hope is an honest analysis of the problems that we face, and I've tried to offer some solutions that I think it would behoove the government to take up. And we stand ready to work with anyone in the House who wants to talk about these solutions or propose other good ones that we haven't thought of yet in order to make life better for Canadians as they stare down a very difficult fall and beyond. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? L'Honorable Secretary.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister and the President of the Treasury Board. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from Winnipeg for his speech and for showing Canadians the overlaps with the fall economic statement and the differences as well. It's important for each party to have the opportunity to explain their position on this common ground between their political party and mine. I'd like to ask a question, a very clear, perhaps a very short one, to my colleague from Winnipeg. Does he think there is enough in this economic statement for him to vote in favor of the Finance Minister's economic statement?
L'Honorable Député de Elmwood-Transcona.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona, I think one of the important considerations when we talk about confidence votes is always, would Canadians be better served by an election, a costly election, at this time? And the answer is no. We will vote in favor of the motion tomorrow to ensure we can continue here to do the work that we should all do to put in place real policies that will really help Canadians during these difficult times, and not ask them to participate and pay for an election as an alternative. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Moose Jaw. Hold on here. I just want to make sure I get it right. Yeah, Moose Jaw, Lake Central, Lanigan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, Madam Speaker, I used to fly airplanes, but I know a little bit about sailing. And one of the things that you want to do is you want to keep the water out of the boat. But what seems to be the policy right now with this Liberal government is throwing water into the boat and drowning Canadians. So I'm going to ask my colleague, who's just spent a bit here on this fall economic update, is he willing to vote against this budget and actually campaign on their own terms and put their own budget compared to what this one has been? Thank you.
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, when an election comes, we will be campaigning on our own terms, just as we work here every day on our own terms to advance the things that we committed to the people who voted for us that we would advance in this place. And we're doing that to the best of our ability and rather effectively on a number of items, I would say. That's right. When it comes to, inflationary spending, I would say, look at the GST rebate. That's targeted at people who have the least amount of money in the country, who have seen extraordinary increases in the price of groceries and rent. That money isn't going to chase more goods. That money is going to try and keep their boat afloat and just buy the things that they used to buy. So the idea that somehow doubling the GST rebate is inflationary is simply false. The poor are not driving inflation in Canada. And if the goal of government policy is to help them get through these difficult, trying times, it won't be contributing to inflation.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Trois-Rivières.
The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to commend the Honourable Member for his speech, but I'd especially like to talk to him about the first part of his speech where he talked about respect. And that's important because we're here to debate ideas, and we all have convictions here in this place. We have ideologies, but we definitely have deep convictions. But what a conviction is that sometimes it doesn't take into account the consequences. Now, if we look at our ideas, we get to the idea of accountability, and that means thinking about the consequences of our convictions. But the member went even further, and he said, let's have respect for each other, and let's promote our ideas, but let's be civilized. That's what I heard in the first part of his speech, and I would like to put the following question to him. What are the risks associated with not promoting respect, and what are the risks associated with shifting to less civility? I'd like to thank my colleague for that question. I think we see those consequences here already in Canada, but we see it elsewhere as well. I'm thinking particularly of the United States, where there was an attack on Capitol Hill itself, on the legislative building, and that is very serious indeed. I think that democracy is in English we say it's an achievement. I don't know. But it's something that we also always have to do for ourselves. It's not something like a box or a pencil that we can hold like an object, a concrete object that remains the same over time. An achievement is something that we have to do ourselves. So we have to work at it ourselves. And if we abandon our democratic culture, and if we lack respect for differences, then we're going to lose our democracy. And personalities who have a great deal of success in undemocratic contexts will take up more and more room and more power.
Your Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to start by thanking the member for Elmwood-Transcona for showing members in this place that it's possible to vigorously and passionately disagree while still being respectful of other people. And I think if we had more of that here, Canadians would be better served by members in this place. And so I thank him for his contribution in that way. My question is that he was able to also point out both areas where money can be saved. For example, if we were, and revenue could be generated for government, if we were to properly tax real estate investment trusts, for example, as well as about speaking about the important needs that Canadians have. For example, Canadians with disabilities who are crying out for emergency supports while living in legislated poverty. Can he speak more about the important connection between both the dollars that are needed to be raised in order to fund the investments that are required to meet these important needs?
Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm certainly happy to do that. I think, you know, we need to see in this time where we see companies making extraordinary profit well beyond what they were making pre-pandemic in a time of massive need. That's a lost opportunity to ensure that people that are struggling, who don't have the extra money in the bank account, can continue to do well. And that is important from a moral point of view, but it's also important from a financial point of view. Allowing large corporations to accrue larger and larger surpluses to pay out to their already rich shareholders is not, it means that the people that don't get the help and support they need, that end up homeless, that don't get access to health care, end up in emergency rooms, end up on the street, end up in the justice system, end up in difficult circumstances that are themselves very costly to remediate. Everyone ends up worse off, and that's why having a fair tax system with proper investments in people who need that investment is a smarter way financially over the long term too.
That's right.
For a brief question, the honourable member of Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. The member actually raised the issue around housing, and he's exactly right in the sense that housing costs went up over 70% under the Harper government and by another $300,000 under the Liberals. Now, on Indigenous, urban Indigenous housing, in my own riding, we're the third largest urban Indigenous community in the country. The $300 million that's been committed will not even address the housing crisis in my own riding. The PBO actually said that we're short over $600 million to meet that gap. So my question to the member is this. How could it possibly be that the Liberals refuse to see reality? Why are Indigenous people's lives are always put in the back burner?
A brief answer for the member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much. And I think the member for Vancouver East makes an excellent point. I can't speak to why this continues to be such a, blind spot of the government. A blind spot is putting it too lightly, because it's a desperate need, and it's an issue of justice for Indigenous people in Canada that they should have the right, which everyone in Canada should have, to a decent home. And that is going to require investment. And you can tell that $300 million, if you do some quick math, which I'd be happy to do at a future time, Madam Speaker, because I see him out of time, is not going to build enough units to get the job done.
That's right.